So hi, I'm Adam Tierney. First of all, I'd like to thank Kazuya and Hyungjong for organizing this wonderful symposium, and also I'd like to thank Tohoku University for hosting. So I am not an applied linguist. I consider myself, when asked to label myself, I call myself an auditory cognitive neuroscientist, and what that means is that I use cognitive neuroscience techniques like EEG and fMRI to examine how people perceive and how their brains represent sound. And I'm particularly interested in individual differences in sound perception, because one of the sort of striking or strange things about prior research on sound perception is that even if you give people very simple tasks, like giving them two sounds and asking them if they're the same or different based on their pitch or their duration, there are massive individual differences between participants in how well they're able to do this. And I'm interested both in why that is, so what it is about people's brains that makes them better or worse at these kinds of tasks, and also about whether or not these individual differences in sound perception might have consequences for the acquisition of language, because there's so much useful and interesting information about language that's present in speech. So I really come from, I do have knowledge of language from a psychology perspective, but my prior knowledge before I started becoming interested in SLA a few years ago, really it was in first language acquisition in children. So when I first became interested in second language acquisition, partly because I met Kazuya, I immediately asked a question that to me felt fairly obvious. Well, so there are individual differences in child first language acquisition that people have been studying for decades, and there are also individual differences in adult L2 acquisition. And again, there's also a lot of work on this. So I thought I would go through the literature and just see what's already known about whether or not these individual differences are driven by different or similar factors. And I think there's a lot of reasons why this is an interesting question, but one reason is that if the foundations of L1 and L2 learning actually are similar or overlapping, then the insights from one field could be applied to the other. And instead of sort of working on their own, researchers in these two fields could pool their results and work together to come up with new hypotheses and new predictions of learning success that might be more accurate. But I was really surprised to find when I started reading papers in SLA that there was actually surprisingly little crosstalk between these fields. And when I stopped to think about it, I realized that in the papers on first language acquisition that I've been reading, there also weren't really any citations to SLA work. So these two fields really do seem to be operated in isolation and don't talk to each other that much. And I found that really, when I started thinking about it, quite surprising. And one reason why that might be is that, especially in SLA, and this might be a caricature because I am new to the field, so if that's true, I apologize, but there do seem to be relatively strong arguments in favor of there being quite different factors underlying L1 and L2 acquisition. So for example, it is known that generally language learners achieve more successful ultimate attainment when they begin language acquisition earlier in life. And that has suggested to some people that children have an innate predisposition to learn language that is lost when language begins to be learned later in life. And this has further suggested to some people that there might be a qualitative shift in mechanisms, that the mechanisms that support L2 learning and the mechanisms that support L1 learning might be basically quite different. And not only that, these settings in which a second language and a first language are learned are often quite different. So first languages tend to be learned as children are immersed in language from a very early age. Even in the womb, children are able to hear the sound patterns of language. They're filtered so they only hear the pitch and the rhythm, but nonetheless there's a lot of information in there that they immediately start picking up on. On the other hand, second language learning tends to be done often in the classroom where people are explicitly taught about language rules, and that seems to be to people a very different process from the way children learn language. Okay, so it's true that there are a lot of differences between how L2 learning and L1 learning happen, but on the other hand, I would suggest that L1 and L2 learning mechanisms may overlap even if they're not identical. So although I agree there probably are profound shifts in the processes that are relevant between L1 and L2 learning, this doesn't mean that there aren't any similarities. So just to take an example, explicit learning may become more important for adult second language learning because it's taking place in the classroom, because adults may have better ability to explicitly attend to and learn language structures. But that doesn't mean that implicit learning is irrelevant, and it may still play a secondary role or even a primary role in adult language learning in certain settings, such as when adults move to a new country and are immersed in a new language. Ultimately, though, I would say this is just an empirical question as to whether or not the factors underlying individual differences in L1 and L2 learning are different versus the same. But there does seem to be surprisingly little research actually addressing this empirical question. And why might that be? Well, I think there are a number of methodological issues that are getting in the way of this research happening. But I think possibly the most important problem that's getting in the way of this comparative research is that the way in which language variability is conceptualized in these two fields is very different. So in research on individual differences in first language learning, variability tends to be conceptualized in terms of so-called disorders. So basically, children are divided into two groups. On the one hand, there are children that have a lot of problems with a particular language task, such as reading or the acquisition of syntax or something like that. And generally, children that are more than 2 standard deviations away from the mean, in sort of the bad direction, are defined as having a disorder, and they're compared to everyone else. And all of the other children are generally lumped together. And this is how studies are designed and how the data are analyzed. And also how these studies are pitched to funders. Generally, the idea is, well, there's this big problem that some children have these very large problems with reading, and we need to figure out what's going on, and we need to solve it. So these are disorders with names like dyslexia and specific language impairment, and there's been decades of research studying variability in L1 language learning using this perspective. And there are a few consequences for how people study language learning variability when it's viewed through this lens of language learning disorders. This generally suggests to people an underlying biological cause. The idea here is that children aren't learning a particular aspect of language not because they lack motivation or because they lack the proper instruction, but because they have some biological difference that's causing them to struggle to learn language. And this has led researchers to search for a so-called core deficit, the one thing, the sort of silver bullet that makes these children have problems with reading or with syntax, that if the researchers can just find that and fix it, then they'll have sort of solved the problem. And researchers have searched for this core deficit, generally using sort of biological techniques, so ideas from cognitive science, but also from genetics and neuroscience techniques. So they've been viewing L1 language learning variability using this sort of disorder or medicalized model, and so they've been using these biological techniques. Now, on the other hand, as far as I can tell, L2 research generally has viewed language learning variability really as variability, as continuous variability in language learning success. So variability has been investigated across all learners. It's not that people with 2 standard deviations away from the mean have been separated and given some special disorder name and then compared to everyone else. I would say that if people did that, it'd probably be easier to find funding, so you might think about it. But I don't think it's necessarily the right way to go about it, because variability really is continuous, both in children and in adults. And I think there's been some consequences from this focus for L2 research as well. So the focus has been, because the model being used is not as medicalized, people aren't talking about disorders, the focus has been less on biological factors and more on a variety of other factors, so demographic, experiential, social, and motivational factors. So this biological model has largely not been used, and so there's not really much research applying genetic and neuroscientific techniques, so this is starting to change in recent years. So there are very large differences in how researchers in these two fields are studying language learning variability, but I do think there is common ground that could be found, because ultimately I think that researchers studying developmental language disorders and SLA researchers are actually studying fundamentally the same thing. They're studying variability in language acquisition, they're just defining it in 2 different ways. So despite the different approaches these fields take, their findings actually might be more relevant to one another than is commonly believed. One of my goals today is just to convince you that researchers in these 2 fields should talk to each other more and should read each other's work. And I'll be, for the rest of this talk, talking about a particular case where I've attempted to apply findings from prior research on auditory processing and first language acquisition to see if they might also apply to the study of individual differences in second language acquisition. Okay, so why might auditory processing be relevant to the acquisition of knowledge of language? Well, one of the amazing things about speech is that it's incredibly information dense. There's a ton of information contained in speech, more than we realize as we're listening to someone talk. The process of understanding speech is so effortless, we don't really think about how amazing it is. But speech is really just a 1D signal. It's just changes in amplitude over time, but it contains and conveys a huge variety of information. So in English, for example, 38 different phonemes at an amazingly high rate of 20 per second are conveyed by speech. And when we think about speech perception, that's the aspect of speech perception I think that we often think about most. But there's a ton of other information also contained in speech. So information about which syllables are stressed and which are not stressed, information about where the boundaries between words are, information about where the boundaries between phrases are, which gives you clues to what the grammatical structure is of a sentence. All of these things are also conveyed via changes in various acoustic cues or dimensions. And not only that, but other aspects of language as well. So pragmatics, or understanding the real intent behind what a speaker is saying, that's also conveyed via changes in acoustic cues. And actually, even stepping outside of language per se, you can learn a lot about a speaker by just listening to the sound patterns of their voice. You can learn about their gender, their relative age, their emotional state. So if I'm talking a little faster than normal, it might be because I'm nervous. And these are all things that you're constantly assessing as you're receiving this relatively actually simple 1D signal. So all of these different types of information need to be conveyed by the manipulation of actually a pretty small set of acoustic cues. So really all that speakers have access to is modulations in pitch, in the higher frequency spectral or frequency content of speech, the duration of different elements at different levels, and also changes in amplitude. And really that's actually it. So each of these cues must play multiple roles because there are so many more types of information than there are cues which contain them. So for example, pitch in speech is often thought of as conveying sort of intonation, which tells you things about, say, which word is emphasized. But it gives you a lot of other information as well. So again, characteristics of the speaker. It also contains some cues to differences between speech sounds, even in English, stress. So there's a lot of information that each one of these cues can tell you. But what that means, unfortunately, is that speech perception places heavy demands on auditory processing, because there are very large individual differences between people in how well they can perceive these cues. So that's known from research on the psychology of sound perception. And as a result, it seems that if, for example, you have trouble perceiving pitch, that might have sort of unfortunate consequences for following the information that's contained in speech and that's been being conveyed by changes in pitch. And in people learning language, that might delay their ability to acquire knowledge about different types of language structures. And this theory has been looked at a lot over the past several decades in research on first language acquisition. There are hundreds of papers that I'm not really going to be able to do justice to here, but I'll just very briefly summarize it. So researchers in the field of L1 acquisition for a long time have been asking, well, what happens when a child has difficulty perceiving one of these cues? Does that have consequences for language acquisition? And is that one of the things that might be different between children who develop a so-called language disorder and children who do not? So developmental language disorders, such as both dyslexia and specific language impairment, have been linked to impairments in a variety of different auditory processing skills, which I'll briefly describe here. But again, there's so many of these papers that I really can't do justice to them. But for example, children with a developmental language disorder are more likely to have problems with as simple a task as frequency discrimination. So what that means is presenting two sounds that are either the same or different, and if they're different, they just differ on the pitch of the sound. That's it. And these are just artificial sounds, or just simple tones. But nonetheless, this very simple task seems to be linked to the presence of developmental language disorders. And a lot of the tests that have been used in this sort of research have been these very simple sound perception tests. These tests use stimuli, they're not verbal, they're just abstract sounds, and they generally focus on a particular specific aspect of sound perception. So there also are, for example, studies on duration perception, so the ability to distinguish sounds based on how long they are, or to reproduce the duration of sounds by holding a button for a certain length of time. And tests like this have also found differences between children with developmental language disorders and children without. Another task that comes up a lot in the literature is the detection or discrimination of amplitude modulation. These are changes in amplitude over time, and the idea is that this is linked to the ability of children to follow changes in the amplitude envelope of speech, or these sort of slow rises and falls of amplitude of speech that can be cues to a variety of things, including speech and word boundaries. So basically, there's a lot of work on how children with developmental language disorders are more likely to have difficulty discriminating between sounds on the basis of some sound dimension, or detecting some characteristics of sounds. Now, I should say, not all children with developmental language disorders actually have these problems. So I don't want to describe this as some researchers have, the sort of magic bullet that distinguishes, say, children with dyslexia from children without. Only about 30% of children with a given language disorder end up having relatively severe sound perception problems. So auditory perception seems to be just one of many factors that goes into language learning, where if it's disrupted, it can cause delays in language acquisition, but it's certainly not the only factor which can cause delays in language acquisition. So auditory processing has also been studied in children with developmental language disorders by studying neural sound encoding. So by studying individual differences in how the brain represents and perceives sound, and linking that to developmental the likelihood of the presence of developmental language disorders. And again, there's a lot of work on this that I don't have time to really do justice to, but one of the things that's come out is that children with language disorders seem to have representations of sound that are less consistent. So if you present the same sound to children over and over again and collect the brain response, it'll vary more from trial to trial in children with language disorders than it does in typically developing children. Okay, so coming from this field and having read all of these papers, when I started thinking about second language acquisition, the question I asked myself is, well, auditory processing has been shown to be something of a bottleneck for language acquisition in children, where since that's one of the ways you can absorb information about the structure of language, it seems to kind of slow language acquisition down if you have trouble processing one of these cues. And I wondered, well, is that also true for adult language acquisition? And I expected to go to the field and be able to read a bunch of research addressing that topic, and I was very surprised to see that there is actually almost no research. Interestingly, there is some research, not from SLA researchers per se, but in psychologists who are interested in language learning, sort of in the lab. So some researchers have shown that either better neural encoding of sound or better auditory processing has been linked to how quickly participants can learn a new speech contrast very quickly in the lab over the course of, say, 1 or 2 hours. And there's been some interesting findings there, but what people haven't done is to see if there's any relationship between differences in auditory processing and language learning success, say, in the real world over the course of months or years, as people are actually learning language in classrooms or immersed in an L2 learning environment. That's really not been studied at all. So I decided to set up to try to study this, first using a technique called the frequency following response, which you've already heard a little about, but I'm going to try to go into in a little more detail, and later using behavioral techniques, which I'll get to in a minute. So next I'm going to tell you about this EEG response called the frequency following response. It's not very well known, so I'm going to go over it in a fair bit of detail. I'm going to talk about how it's collected and how it has certain characteristics that make it a very useful way to measure individual differences in auditory processing. So the frequency following response is an EEG response, and that means really what we're fundamentally measuring is changes in electrical potential over time, over the course of an experiment. This lasts about half an hour. So participants have 3 sensors on their head, one on the ear, one on the forehead, and one on the top of the head. And what we actually see on the monitor as this is happening is essentially this squiggly line, which is changes in electrical potential over time. And what the participant is doing over the course of this very boring half an hour is hearing this same speech sound 6,000 times. So that synthesized syllable you heard from Kazuya, you heard about 6 times. Let's multiply that by 1,000, and that's the experience of being a participant in his experiments. And because that's so boring, we don't ask them to pay attention to the sound. We allow them to do something else they might find more entertaining. So they can read it, and they can bring in their own book that they want to read anyway, and they're basically paid to just ignore some boring sound and read something they wanted to read in the first place. Okay, so what do we actually do with this half an hour of a single line? Well, what we do is we look to see how that line changes after each of those 6,000 sound presentations. So we wind up with what are called 6,000 trials, basically 6,000 vectors of numbers that tell us what's happening after each sound presentation. And then we take all of these vectors and we average them to get an average response that looks like this. But this is not the frequency following response. This really contains 2 different types of responses. One of them is the cortical response, so that's coming from auditory cortex, and the other is the frequency following response, which is what we're primarily interested in. So you can actually see, just looking at this average, you can see those 2 responses superimposed. So on the one hand, you can see that there's this slow fall and rise of potential, and that's the cortical response. So the time frame here is about 200 milliseconds. So the time frame over which this cortical response is happening is very slow. So to get rid of the cortical response, and we can look at it later, but it's not what we're interested in now, all we do is just filter out the lower frequencies, filter out all that's happening at this slow time scale, and then we're left with all these little more jagged spikes, and this is the frequency following response. So that's how this response is collected, but why might we want to do this, and what is it actually telling us about an individual's auditory system? Well, the most interesting thing about this response is contained in the name. It actually reproduces the frequencies that are present in the stimulus. And so you can see this here. This is the stimulus that was used to elicit the response. And then this is the actual response itself from a single participant. And obviously they don't look identical, but there are obvious similarities between the response and the stimulus. The response actually looks like the waveform that was presented to participants. And so it's a brain wave that looks a lot like a sound wave, where the higher frequencies have been filtered out. So what's interesting about this is that the response can be analyzed using some of the same tools that acousticians and phoneticians use actually to analyze sound and to analyze speech. And by doing that, we can examine how well certain aspects of sound are actually represented in an individual's auditory system. So here's another way to look at the stimulus and the response. So what I'm graphing here are the frequencies that are present in the stimulus. So you can see here that the pitch is at 100 hertz, there's the first formant at 700 hertz, and the second formant between 1200 and 1300 hertz. And you can actually see some of these same features in the frequencies that are present in the response. So this is an average across 40 participants. You can see the fundamental frequency here, you can see the first formant here, and you can see the second formant here. So we can actually take these different aspects of speech, and we can isolate them from the response, and we can look at how well different participants seem to be representing these different aspects of speech. Another important characteristic of the response that makes it quite useful for studying individual differences in sound perception and the function of the auditory system is that there are very large individual differences between participants. Some participants have giant, beautiful responses that robustly represent all these features, and some responses are much smaller and are much more variable from trial to trial. And importantly, these differences between subjects are highly replicable. There's very high test-retest reliability. And that means that if we bring a subject in and then bring them in this case 4 years later, the responses across participants are very different, but within a participant, they're quite similar between these 2 sessions. For example, the timing of these different peaks, they're a little hard to see up here, but they're accurate to within about 0.1 to 0.2 milliseconds. So an individual really has a characteristic sort of neural signature that might tell us something about how their auditory system represents sound. Okay, so I mentioned that the frequency following response is analyzed by filtering out the cortical response, and that tells you something about the likely origin of this response. So another interesting thing about it is that we actually have a pretty good idea where in the brain it's coming from, and that's pretty rare with EEG. Normally with EEG, we don't really have that much information about where the signal is coming from. We have sort of a vague idea, but it's not generally the strength of the technique. But here, based on work in animals, we know that the origin of the frequency following response is mostly not the cerebral cortex. And that's because it contains such high frequencies. It contains frequencies up to 1,500 hertz, which is quite high compared to the information that is represented in most of the auditory system. So neurons in the brainstem can do what's called phase locking to the stimulus to generate this response up to these higher frequencies, but that's not the case for neurons in the cortex. They can only phase lock up to about 100 hertz. So the lower frequency parts of the response might have some contributions of the cortex, but most of it is really driven by subcortical or brainstem processing. And the reason that's important is that it's really a quite low-level response, you could think of it. It's really indexing what's happening as the information comes from the ear towards the brain. And so it's relatively unaffected by things like attention and cognitive state. And that's a problem if what you're interested in is attention or cognitive state and its effects on sound processing. But it's actually a benefit if what you want to do is investigate individual differences in implicit sound processing. So it can be very difficult with behavioral measures to distinguish between explicit and implicit processing. But using the frequency following response, we really know that it's a fairly pure measure of implicit processing because it's so unaffected by what people are actually doing when we record it. And in fact, it's possible to record even if people are sleeping, which makes it quite useful, for example, studying sound processing in babies who it's very hard to get to do anything you tell them. Okay, so in an initial study that really launched my interest in this work, we looked at whether auditory processing might be one factor helping to determine how successful Japanese L1 speakers were in learning to perceive English consonants. So we looked at 25 native Japanese speakers who were resident for between 0 to 5 years in the UK, and we recorded FFRs not to the da, so that was a little unusual, but to la and ra. And then we wound up, the original idea was to look at differences between the responses, but what I'm going to show you, we just sort of collapsed across those two responses. And to look at the robustness of the frequency following response, the robustness of sound representation in the brainstem, to see if that might help determine performance on a test of English consonants. And what we found, honestly somewhat to my surprise, was that this did seem to be potentially a major factor helping to determine how successful people were at learning to perceive English speech after coming to the UK. So what's being plotted here is the frequency following response in a sort of fancy colored 2D fashion. But basically the more warm the colors are here, the more robust the response. These are frequencies from 100 hertz, which is the pitch of the sound, up to 600, and this is a median split, where the participants who were best at the task are up here, and the participants who were worst at the task are down here. And you can see this large difference in the robustness of the response. And that's true also when you look at the data more continuously. So this is a scatter plot displaying on the x-axis performance on the speech perception test, and on the y-axis this measure of the robustness of subcortical brainstem sound processing. Okay, so what is this actually telling us? Well, it suggests that implicit auditory processing actually at a very early level, so even within the auditory brainstem, before the information has even reached the cerebral cortex, might be one thing that's helping determine the success of second language learning. And so in a follow-up study with Kazuya, we looked at whether both explicit and implicit auditory processing might explain independent variance in how successful people are at learning to perceive second language speech. So we have this nice implicit measure of auditory processing that's relatively pure, so we sort of built on that by adding some explicit behavioral tests of sound perception. And these were all inspired by previous work on sound perception and language learning in children learning their first language. So all of the measures we included have been linked to language learning in children in prior work. I was also interested to look into whether auditory processing can explain variance in acquisition of other second language skills, like syntax. And it might be kind of strange to ask whether sound perception might lead to individual differences in understanding of the syntax of language. Because we think of syntax as being this sort of very high level, very abstract, very cognitive thing, whereas sound perception is this very low level perceptual thing. So there seems to be a wide gap between them. But in fact, as I mentioned earlier, there are a lot of useful cues to syntax embedded in sound. And it's known that this is something that even adults speaking their first language, this is information people will use to disambiguate ambiguous syntactic structures. And also something babies will use to start learning about the structure of the language they're being exposed to. So it's possible that these prosodic, these sort of melodic patterns might be one cue that people learning a second language are using to start learning about the syntax of the language that they're surrounded by. So in this study, we were looking at speakers of Polish as a first language, because as it turns out, there are a lot of Polish speakers in London. And we gave these participants a number of auditory processing measures, including 2 rhythm measures that I'm not going to talk too much about here, and measures of sound discrimination based on, again, prior work on first language acquisition. And we also looked at subcortical encoding of sound by measuring the frequency following response, as I already described. We included 2 dependent measures. The first was a test of English vowel perception, and the second was a grammatical judgment test, a timed grammatical judgment test. And importantly, this test was presented visually. So there was no speech perception component of this test. What they did was they saw a sentence appear on the screen for about 3 seconds, and then the sentence disappeared, and they were asked to indicate whether the sentence was grammatical or ungrammatical. So what we found was that, in fact, auditory processing as measured, oh, you can't see those dots, well, just imagine that they're there. That auditory processing as measured both behaviorally and neurally was a major factor that seemed to determine whether participants were successful at having learned to perceive second language speech. In particular, it was spectral processing that seemed to be the strongest predictor. What spectral processing means here, these are tasks that require participants to focus on frequency characteristics of sound. So there's a pitch perception test and also a test of the perception of formants. The stimuli are not actual speech sounds, they're not vowels, they're just artificial sounds that contain a couple of formants. And then the other factor that seemed to be important was, again, the robustness of the FFR, but here it was specifically the robustness of the representation of one of the higher frequency formants, which makes sense because that's one of the major cues which distinguish English vowels from one another. And somewhat surprisingly, we also found that auditory processing was linked to grammatical judgment as well. In this case, we didn't find a significant relationship between FFR encoding and grammatical judgment, although actually I'm very stringently correcting for running all these multiple comparisons, so there is a relationship here that would be significant without that correction. But the thing that came out most significantly was that there was a relationship, again, between these behavioral auditory processing measures, both the time-based temporal measures and the frequency-based spectral measures, and successful acquisition of the grammatical rules of English. And finally, I was interested, and I must say quite surprised, to see that there was not a significant relationship between these explicit behavioral measures of sound perception and these implicit neural measures of sound perception. And so because of that, we ran a follow-up analysis where we looked to see if these 2 measures might be explaining independent variance in how successful people were at learning, in this case, English speech perception. And what we found was that auditory frequency-based processing by itself explained about 38% in participants' understanding of English speech. Age of acquisition added about another 10%, and then our neural result, our neural data point added about 6% on top of that. So these do seem to be very different factors that are independently explaining how successful second language learners are. Okay, so what we found is that auditory processing seems to predict not only second language speech perception, but also grammatical judgment. And this has a couple of potential consequences. So first, it makes me wonder whether auditory training, so really causing people to focus on these aspects of sound and getting them better at perceiving specifically the pitch of sounds or the duration of sounds, whether that might be one way to speed up second language learning. So because some learners who are struggling to learn a second language, it might be because they have undiagnosed certain severe problems with sound perception. I certainly don't think this is why, this would explain why all people who are struggling, but it might be one factor. And so in these people who have these issues, maybe undiagnosed, it might be possible to give them auditory training, and that might help them learn a second language faster, especially when immersed in a second language environment. This also suggests to me, given how successful these very simple, very quick tests of sound perception were in predicting the participants' vowel perception, that maybe they should be incorporated into language aptitude batteries because it might improve their predictive power. This is such a different measure from the type of skills that are incorporated in language aptitude batteries. And in fact, it doesn't really correlate at all with the llama. It suggests that if those were combined together, the resulting test might have quite a lot of predictive power. And I found it quite interesting that behavioral neural tests seem to be independent predictors of second language learning, and this suggests they might index explicit and implicit aspects of auditory processing, respectively. More generally, though, what this respects to me, what these results suggest to me is that it is valuable to compare child L1 and adult L2 learning. And one of the reasons why it's valuable is that it's a valuable source of hypotheses. There's been so much work on genetics and neuroscience techniques as applied to L1 acquisition, and so if we want to start applying those techniques to second language learning, we don't have to start from scratch. We can benefit from these decades of work and generate at least some hypotheses that may not apply to second language learners, but they may, in which case we could really jumpstart the field and make some quite rapid advances. So before I finish, I'd like to acknowledge all of the people who have helped me with this research. So Kazuya, who sort of introduced me to second language acquisition, and the students who actually did all of the work, Magdalena Kashlika, Kui-sun, and Akihiro Onote. Thank you.
Thank you.